Thanks for joining us at Feather Sound Church as we grow through the teaching of God's Word.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm just very honored to come and be able to have this opportunity to share with you just a little bit about myself. I've been in ministry about 13 years. My wife and I have been married 14 years. We have 4 children. They're all up in Pennsylvania freezing while I'm golfing and enjoying sunny weather. And so I feel bad for them. But I'm grateful to be here. Thank you for having me. A couple, maybe 2-3 months back, we started a series leading into our Christmas service that was entitled Make Waves. And the whole point of the series was just to think about the things that we do in life and how they ripple out into the lives of other people and how they can even ripple out into generations beyond us. And so we started looking at the women in the family tree of Jesus Christ and how their lives impacted not just the time around them, but later into a great generation, into the Son of God coming to save all mankind. And as we are going through that series, I was just kind of wrestling with it because the thought just came to my mind of how do we make waves when the waves of our own lives are crashing over us? It's really easy to talk about that when everything's good in life and things are going the way we want it to and we are in a position to positively impact other people. But what about when everything is just so consuming us that we can't even fathom what we would do for somebody else? We can't even figure out what we're doing in our own life. And that idea started to stir in me even more. I went home, I was visiting with my mother for Thanksgiving, and my mom has always been a really hard worker. She's always taken care of us. I have 3 brothers, so 4 boys. She always took really good care of us. But the job that she works in, it doesn't have any kind of benefits. There's no retirement package. There's no future plan. And I can remember once I asked my mom, I was talking to her on the phone, and I said, "What's your future plan? What do you plan to do when this is all said and done?" And I think she was half joking, but also half serious. She said, "Well, I hope that by that point, one of my boys will have a place for me to stay." And I'm usually not really good at picking up on things. I should have said, "Oh yeah, we'll take care of you no matter what." But my response was, "That's not a great plan." But what I realized is that with my mom, so much of her plan was wrapped up in what she didn't plan. And a lot of times life is like that. A lot of times the things that we planned are thrown out of whack because of what we didn't plan. What my mom didn't plan is that after 27 years of marriage, her husband would leave her for a younger woman and have an affair. What my mom didn't plan was that her mother would go into dementia. What she didn't plan was that my uncle, who was 53, who took care of my grandmother, took care of her mother, would tragically die of an accident this summer. What my mom didn't plan was that the community she lived in would become so infested with drugs that her house now costs less than $10,000. That's its value. What my mom didn't plan was that in the midst of all of that and now going and feeding my grandmother and doing all these things, what she didn't plan is that 13 years after separation from my father, she would just now begin going through divorce proceedings. And what I realized is that my mom had a plan that didn't pan out. And I began thinking about this whole concept of making waves, and I thought, what would I even say to my mother? She's in a situation where it feels like the waves of life are drowning her. The only thought in her mind is to keep her head above water, let alone make waves into the lives of other people. What would I say to her? How would I encourage her? How would I move her to take the very waves that she feels like she's drowning in and use those to impact people around her? I began thinking about a story. The story I want to look at with you this morning is the story of Ruth. And in truth, if you were to go in the Old Testament and you study the story of Ruth, it's titled Ruth, but the reality is it's actually a story of Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi. It's a story of somebody who went through drastic waves in her life, and it's a story of God working through those waves to impact not only her, but generations to come. Our story begins with a family that's whole, a family that's healthy, but they're struggling. It begins with a man named Elimelech. And Elimelech had his wife Naomi. They had 2 sons. They lived in a city called Ephrath. It was really what was called the fruitful area of Bethlehem. But the truth is, fruitfulness is not what they experienced in their lives. There was a famine in the land. Elimelech could not provide for his family, so he picked his family up. He traveled 75 miles away to the area of Moab, and there he was going to prepare for his family and care for his family. And it was there that Elimelech dies. So Naomi loses her husband. Now, in the time period, her sons had taken wives. They both married, but within the next 10 years, her 2 sons die. Now, as a young man, if I read through that text, I kind of read through it. Oh, that's a story in the scripture, or just read through it. But what struck me is that was someone's life. That was an actual person who just lost her husband, just lost her 2 sons. What would I feel in that moment? Everything was stripped from her. Everything that she knew, everything that she had. In their culture, all of the belongings it rested upon the male heir in the family. So when her husband died, everything transferred to her sons. When her sons died, she had nothing. She could not return to Bethlehem and take back her land. She had no way of providing for herself. She lost it all. And her story begins with a broken woman who's lost everything that she loved, everything that she's cared for. And she learns that there's now food back in Judah, so she takes her daughters-in-law back towards Bethlehem. And on the way back, she pauses for a moment and says to them, she says, "There's nothing for you there. I have nothing to offer you. Just go back home, start a family, remarry. I can't do anything for you." And they argue back and say, "No, we're not going to leave you. We're going to go with you." And so she says, "Listen, even if I were to get back there, there's nothing that I can do. Even if I were to remarry right now, would you really wait for me to have a son and that son to grow up and you to become a part of that? Would you really wait for that? Just go home. Just restart your life." In essence, I feel like Naomi is saying, God is against me, and if you follow me, he's going to be against you too. And she looks at them and she tells them to go away. And one of the daughters-in-law, her name was Orpah, not Oprah, although a little sidelight. Oprah's real name is Orpah, if you didn't know that. In her birth certificate and it was Orpah, but nobody knew how to say it or spell it, so it became Oprah, and that became the legend of who she was. But anyhow, that doesn't matter. But Orpah goes home, but we read there that Ruth clings to Naomi. She holds on. She stays with her. She sticks to Naomi. And Naomi tries to convince Ruth to leave, tells her, you got to go. And this is what Ruth says to Naomi. She says, "Do not urge me to leave you or turn back from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Thus may the Lord do to me and worse, if anything but death parts you and me." Ruth looks at Naomi and she says, "I am going everywhere that you go. Where you live, I will live. Where you die, I will die." And even though here is Naomi giving this picture of God is against me, she says, even though you think God is against you, I will still follow that God. I'm not leaving you. And the question that I want to ask you this morning is, do you have a friend like that? Do you have somebody in your life that they will just cling to you no matter what waves life brings? Maybe you're here this morning, you're kind of checking out church. Maybe you're checking out the whole faith thing, and you're like, I just want to figure out why these people are so weird. And you're just coming in here this morning. I want to tell you that there are wonderful people in this church who can be that for you. That when life is crashing over you and you don't know what's next and you don't have answers and you don't know where to go, there are people in this church who can cling to you in the midst of that and bear that burden with you. We need people like that in our lives. We talk about at our church, we call them focused friendships. Because it's really easy to have surface friendships. It's really easy to come in all the time and, hey, how's how's the weather, and what about that game, and it's all surface stuff. We really want to encourage our people to say, you know what, how do we get intentional in our relationships and carry each other's burdens and keep each other accountable and push each other to grow? We need that. We need that in our life. And what I love about this story is Ruth just clings to her. She clings to her. They return home, and as they get into Bethlehem, the people recognize her. The women of the city recognize Naomi, and they begin saying, is this Naomi? Is this Naomi? Is she back? And here's what Naomi says. She says, do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me. I went out full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. In essence, what she says is, don't call me pleasant one. Her name, Naomi, meant pleasant one. Don't call me pleasant. Call me bitter one. Because God is against me. God has taken everything from me. God could have done something in my life, and He didn't. He didn't show up when I needed Him the most. Don't call me pleasant, because I'm not pleasant. Naomi was probably a person that we wouldn't want to spend a whole lot of time with. She wasn't a person that when you go up to her and you say, hey, how are you? Oh, I'm fine. She didn't say that. She didn't give that surface answer. She was very real about her perception of God. And she came in there and she said, I am broken. What I recognize with her is that I don't think she ever got to the point where she doubted God existed, but she seriously was doubting if God truly wanted good things in her life. She wouldn't be a person we invite to our small groups, because she would tell us how it is and how she really feels, and we get uncomfortable with that. Don't say that. We got to put on a face. She says, I'm bitter. I'm broken. God has taken everything from me. And I recognize that in Ruth's response, there's something very powerful. So often I see in my own life that when somebody is being real and honest about how they feel, I have students who come in and they're going through some major issues and their family's all broken and there's all these things happening. I so desperately want to pick them out of that situation. I want to fix it all. I want to make it all right. I want to say all the right words. And so often what we do is we make these trite statements like, it's going to be okay. Notice that Ruth doesn't do any of that. She doesn't make any of those statements. She just says, I'm here. And what I recognize is that instead of telling people, hey, it's going to be better, when I don't even know that, to just cling to them in the midst of it. And that clinging to them in the midst of their pain, to show them that pain causes in us a greater longing for God. To allow that pain that they're sitting in to stir in them a greater longing for God. You know, think about how our physical bodies will tell us when something is wrong. We'll have this pain that tells us there's something wrong. You need to make it right. And what if our emotional and spiritual pain is leading us to understand that there is something desperately wrong with our world, and we need the only one who can fix it, Jesus Christ. That it's meant to stir in us a longing for the one who can fix what is broken in our world. And instead of leading my students to reject that pain, to step out of that pain, to rather sit with them in that pain and show them how that should stir in them a greater longing for God. Naomi is broken, yet Ruth sits with her in that pain and clings to her in that pain. So often when we're in the worst moments of our lives, we seclude ourselves. We push everybody away. We want to kind of wallow away in a hole somewhere. And what we need most in those moments is to cling to other people. To allow those who love us and care for us to come around us and support us in the midst of that struggle. And as they return home, the end of chapter 1 says, and it was the beginning of barley harvest. I believe that verse is very powerful because in essence it's revealing it was the start of a new season. They had been through the winter in more ways than one. But spring is coming. A new season is coming. New hope is coming. You know, if you were to travel out west, you would find these massive trees called sequoias. These trees are like behemoths. They're beautiful. They're majestic. They reach hundreds of feet into the air. They could be so broad, so big that you could actually cut holes into them and drive cars through them. These are massive trees. But they don't come to be without struggle and trial. The truth is that thousands of seeds drop every year, but very few of those seeds ever germinate to become these massive trees that we see today. And as I started studying these trees and kind of researching a little bit about them, what I found is that if a seed falls right before a heavy snow and is buried by that heavy snow, it is far more likely to germinate and become one of these massive trees. If a forest fire sweeps in, that forest fire will cause the cones that those seeds sit in to open up, and it will take away all of the foliage that would hinder that from growing, and is more likely to become this massive tree that we see. And what I recognize is that sometimes it's in the darkest, most difficult moments that greatness is developed. That sometimes for us, it takes God emptying us so that he can fill us with so much more. And Naomi went through a season of emptying her perspective of who God was, emptying her perspective of what she expected God to do in her life so that God could fill her with a brand new perspective of who he was and what he would do. So as they get there and they settle in, they realize that they got to survive, they got to eat. So Ruth says, I'm going to go out and I'm going to glean in the fields, meaning she was going to go harvest, and she was going to go into these fields that were not her own, but she was going to take of the crops that fell to the ground. And we might look at that and say, well, that's stealing. You can't do that. But in their culture, God had designed it that way so that those who were poor and those who were in need, they could go. And he said to his people, do not harvest all the way to the edges. And whatever you drop, leave it so that those who are in need can come and get it. And that's exactly what Ruth goes to do. And as she goes to do that, we read this. It says, Ruth happened to come to the portion of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech. I love the wording of the author because he's using coincidence sarcastically. He's saying she just so happened to arrive at Boaz's field. The man who was a close family relative to Naomi, the man who could be what they knew as a kinsman redeemer, the guy who, if he wanted to, could buy them out of slavery, if he wanted to, could buy their land back, if he wanted to, could marry into that family and continue the name of Elimelech. It was something that meant so much to them, and she just so happens to show up at his place. What I think the author wants us to see is that moment was not coincidental. God had not forgotten about Naomi. God had not given up on Naomi. He was orchestrating things to lead her to a different place. Guys, what would it look like for us if we understood that every interaction that we have in life is not coincidental? That every person you talk to, every interaction you have did not just so happen. God divinely orchestrated that moment. How much would we experience the work of God if we approached every interaction saying, God did not just allow this to happen. This is not just coincidental. I stepped into this moment divinely, and God wanted this interaction to be. How would that change the way we interact with people? How would that change the way we experience God and how he works in life? Boaz sees Ruth. He begins asking his servants, who is this young woman? And they tell her, she's the Moabite woman who came back with Naomi. She's been serving her and providing for her. She's been working all morning long. She barely took a break. She's just such a hard worker. And you get this impression that Boaz is intrigued, one, by her character, but as you read the text, you understand that he's also intrigued because she's a very young, beautiful woman. And so he's intrigued, and he goes to her and he says to her, listen, this is what I want you to do, Ruth. Make my field your exclusive place. Don't go anywhere else. And he says to her, people have been talking. When you hear that about you, how does that usually make you feel? Yeah, there's word around the town. People have been talking about you. Usually that's not good. Usually like, oh man, what did they say? What did they find out? But when he says this to her, it's nothing but praise. People have been talking about you, and they talk about how wonderful your character is, how hard you've worked for Naomi, all the things that you've done for Naomi. And he says to her, my prayer is that God would bless you for the way you've treated Naomi. And my prayer is that God would cover you with his wings. What Boaz didn't recognize as he was making that statement was that he would be the answer to his own prayer. That he would be the very extension of God's wings over Ruth and Naomi. And so Boaz goes to his servants and he says to them, he says, do not insult her, let her glean whatever she wants, and accidentally drop some more for her. He goes above and beyond. He goes beyond the law. And what I recognize is that in Boaz's situation, as he's looking at somebody who's being crushed by the waves of life, his way of making waves and his way of impacting her life and those around him was to be generous. They just came out of a famine. And so often when we go through famine in our life, what do we want to do? We want to hoard. Let me make sure that I'm okay. Let me make sure that my family's okay. Boaz doesn't do that. He just becomes more generous. And in his generosity, he's making impact all over his community. I want to encourage you, if God has given you the means in anything, not just finances. I read something the other day that was talking about how, money is it shifts all the time. You give a college student $10, that's huge for them. You give a millionaire $10, But I can give both of those individuals an hour of my time, and that's equal on both ends of the spectrum. Because we all only have 24 hours in a day. So it doesn't have to be financial. It could be your time. It could be sitting with somebody, clinging to somebody. But if God has given you the means, be generous with it. That's how we make impact in the lives of other people. Boaz does that, and he lets her glean, and she finishes the day, and she goes home. And as we read, when she gets home, what she has with her is the equivalent of half of a month's wages in a single day. And she walks into the door, and Naomi sees what she has, and she's like, where were you today? Where did you go? And she says, I happened to show up at this place where this man named Boaz was the master. And all of a sudden, you see a new perspective beginning to develop in Naomi. All of a sudden, she's starting to see God in a whole new way. This woman who was so bitter, so broken, who thought God was against her, starts saying new things. She looks at her and she says, may he be blessed of the Lord, who has not withdrawn his kindness to the living and the dead. And all of a sudden, Naomi starts recognizing that God is bigger than this life. God is bigger than death, and he orchestrates and works in something that is beyond this world, beyond my life, beyond me. And she looks at Ruth and she says, it is good. The woman who was so bitter said, I am bitter, I am not pleasant, don't call me that, who couldn't see any goodness in her world, says, it is good that you stay there. Do you see her starting to change her perspective of who God is and what he would do? She's growing in her perspective of who he is. And she's starting to change the things that she's saying. He's a God of both the living and the dead. And so when you come to chapter 3, Naomi comes up with this grand idea. And she says to Ruth, she says, here's what I want you to do. He could be our kinsman redeemer. He could be the guy that saves us. What I want you to do is I want you to get your best clothes on. And I want you to wash yourself up, and I want you to put your finest perfume on. In essence, I feel like she's saying, you caught his eye when you were sweaty and stinky and dirty. Imagine what happens when you show up like this. And I want you to go there, and at the end of the day, when they're finished with the harvest and he lays down on the threshing floor, what I want you to do is I want you to go, take his cloak, uncover it from his feet, and cover yourself. Now, we could read that, and we could hear that and say, what in the world are they talking about? Let me explain what's happening. In their culture, when they were collecting the harvest, they would collect throughout the day, and when they got to the end of the day, they would take the stalks of wheat and barley or whatever it was, they would take it to the threshing floor. And they would have animals walk across that to separate the grain from the chaff and all of the stalk and everything. Or they would take sleds and they would ride those sleds over and it'd separate. And then they would gather that up and they would throw it into the air and the wind would blow away what was unnecessary and all the grain would fall to the floor. And after they did that, his whole bank account was now sitting on that threshing floor. He's not going home. He's going to sleep there to make sure. They just came out of famine. I'm not going to leave my livelihood here. So he would sleep there, and his servants would sleep there. And when she comes in, we're told, and you can read in Exodus, where a man has a cloak. He takes that cloak off at night. He covers his feet to keep himself warm. What he would do is he would cover his feet, and her coming in and taking the cloak and putting it over her, it wasn't anything seductive or sexual. It was her saying, I submit to you. I'm willing to be under your care. In essence, if you want to marry me, I will marry you. And that's exactly how he interprets it. In fact, she comes in, she does that. He doesn't even notice at first. He's still sleeping, and then he's awoken, and he's startled because here's this woman at his feet, and he says, who are you? Which any one of us would say if somebody was at our feet when we woke up in the middle of the night. Who are you? And she tells him, you are our kinsman redeemer. And in essence, if you're willing to take me, I'm willing to be taken. So he tells her, listen, I am so blessed and honored that you would choose me, an old man, instead of all of the wealthy, rich, young men. I'm so honored that you would choose me, but there is somebody else who's a closer relative. And because he's a closer relative, he has the right to take you and take the land and take the family. And so I'm going to do this right. I'm going to do this the way the law prescribes. I'm going to honor you, honor your character. I'm going to do this right. So he gives her a gift. He sends her home. He says, I'm going to go tomorrow. I'm going to see if he wants to do that. If he doesn't, then I will redeem you. So he sends her home, and the gift he sends her home with is twice as much as what she went home with the other day. She walks into the door, and I imagine in her mind, she's probably confused as to what just happened. I put myself out there. I just told this guy I want to be married. He gave me some barley and sent me home. But when she walks in the door, Naomi sees the gift and she makes the connection. She understands probably a whole lot more than Ruth understands what he's saying and what he's about to do. And notice the words that she says. Notice the broken one becoming the voice of hope. Naomi looks at Ruth and she says, wait, my daughter, until you know how the matter turns out. For the man will not rest until he has settled it today. Be patient. Hold on. Wait, because he will not rest until he has settled it today. You know what I love about that statement? It's a statement that Naomi herself needed to hear in her own heart. It's a statement that she needed to understand God was speaking to her. That God was looking at Naomi and saying, just wait. Just be patient. Just hold on, because I will not rest until I settle the matter. That through his son, Jesus Christ, he was saying, just wait, for this man, Jesus, will not rest until he settles the matter. Everything that is broken in your life, he will fix. Everything that is wrong with our world, he will one day make right. Just wait, for this man will not rest until he settles the matter. And Christ comes onto the scene, and while his disciples are resting, they're sleeping, and he's looking to a cross, and he knows that that's what's coming. He knows that the wrath of God is about to be on his shoulders. He would not rest until he reached that cross. And Jesus would not rest until he was on that cross, and on that cross he screamed out, "It is finished." He would not rest, and even though in the tomb, sealed by death, sealed by a grave, he would strip open that tomb and declare himself victorious over sin and death. Jesus will not rest until one day he comes back to make what is wrong right in our world and to take us back to be with himself. This man will not rest until he makes the matter right. And I started thinking, what would I say to my mom? Just wait. Just wait. Because I know that my Lord and Savior Jesus Christ will not rest until he settles all these matters in your life. The waves that others have created that are drowning you, he will wash those away. He will not rest. And the truth is, I'm here this weekend because a former student of mine, young, early 20s, he's battling cancer. And things aren't looking good for him. And I think, what would I say to him? What would I say to his family? What would I say to his mom, his wife? I can only say, just wait. Because Jesus will not rest until he settles the matter in your life. Everything that is broken, he will restore. Everything that seems hopeless, he will fill with hope. So the next morning comes and Boaz gets up and does exactly what he said. He goes to the gate, which is kind of like City Hall. It's where judgments happen. It's where exchanges were made. And so he goes there and he sits with the leaders and elders of the community, and he waits until this other closer relative comes by. And as he comes by, he calls him over and he tells him the situation. He says, listen, our close brother Elimelech, he has land. You could be the redeemer. You're the closer relative. You could be the redeemer of it. And he says, oh, yeah, I'd like to do that. And then Boaz says, but along with that, you also need to redeem the daughter-in-law, Ruth, and Naomi. And all of a sudden he says, oh, no, I don't want to do that. I don't want to jeopardize the inheritance that my children might have or my own inheritance. And he says, I don't want to do that. And what's interesting to me is so often people are eager and ready to serve until they know what it will cost. He says, no, you take it. So Boaz, in the sight of those witnesses, says, I will marry her. I will take the land. I will redeem them. He marries Ruth. They have a child. And this story that began with Naomi broken ends with Naomi holding this child in her arms, looking down at this child. And I just picture in my mind, and this is just how my mind works, but I picture her sitting on a rocking chair. Probably didn't have a rocking chair, but I picture her in her old age sitting on a rocking chair holding this baby, and she's looking into the face of that child. And in that moment, all of her pain is not gone. We're not meant to believe that in this story it's all fixed now because a new baby showed up. We're not meant to believe that. Her husband's still gone. Her sons are still gone. That pain will exist in her life until she returns to be with them. But in that child, she was beginning to see a new hope. She was beginning to see God that was bigger than what she perceived. And a God who could do greater things than she ever perceived. In fact, the women of the town, they name her child, which that's a crazy concept to me. Like if I had a child and then everybody in the community said, hey, we're going to call it this. Oh, okay, cool. But they name her child, and they name the child Obed, which means servant. In essence, they're saying to her, this child, Naomi, when you thought you were lost, when you thought that God didn't care for you anymore, this child will one day serve you. He's not left you alone. And as the author closes out the book of Ruth, he says that from this child would come a man named Jesse. And from Jesse would come a man named David. And for him, and for everybody in his time period, as he's writing this, they understood and believed that David was the greatest thing to ever hit the face of the earth. David was the greatest king of Israel. And what he was saying is that Naomi didn't recognize that in this child, God was doing something that was bigger than her. He was doing something that was nationwide, but he didn't even see the end result of it. What he didn't understand that was from that line, from Boaz to Obed to Jesse to David, would one day come a man named Jesus. And one day in that same city, in a cold, dirty cave somewhere, a teenage girl would also be looking into the face of a baby. And she would be looking into the face of the one who would be the kinsman redeemer of all of mankind. The one who could redeem us, buy us out of our slavery to sin. The one who could buy back our world that is broken and make it right. The one who could give us a new name and make us sons and daughters of the heavenly God. She did not realize that she was, in essence, looking in the face of the one who would one day restore all of creation. Guys, the beautiful picture in this story is that in the midst of our struggle, in the midst of our crushing waves, God is orchestrating things that are far bigger than we can ever imagine. And I want to encourage you, maybe you're in that situation this morning, and maybe what you need the most is just to cling to somebody. Don't run away. Don't hide out. Cling to somebody. Maybe God has blessed you with the ability to be generous, the opportunity to be generous. Use that to stir in the lives of other people. Maybe more than anything, what we need to hear this morning is just wait. Just wait. Because this man, Jesus Christ, will not rest until he settles all matters in your life. As Jesus, I'm going to invite the worship team to come and close us out. But I want to share this with you as Jesus was approaching those last moments. He looked at his disciples and he said this in John chapter 14. He said, "Do not let your hearts be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, I would have told you, for I go to prepare a place for you. If I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also." As they heard those words, they would understand them in a very specific context. They would understand them within the context of a Hebrew marriage, a Hebrew engagement. That a man, a groom, would go to a young woman and be engaged to her, and it wasn't like ours where it's like, hey, this is this trial period. We could figure out if we really want to commit to this or not. It was a commitment. And so a man would make this commitment to a young woman, and he would leave her at home with her in her father's house, and he would travel back to his father's house. And for 12 months, they would be separated. And in those 12 months, he would be preparing a place to one day go back to get her, to celebrate with all of her family, to come back to his town, to celebrate with all of his family, and to forever live with her in that home. But she had to live through those 12 months. And there were probably times in those 12 months where she's wondering if he is coming back. Or she's wondering when he is coming back. Or she's saying, I am so sick of mom and dad, I can't wait till he comes back. And there's all these struggles probably happening in that moment. But when he shows up, none of that stuff matters anymore. And all of that time was designed and was meant to stir in her a deeper longing for the groom to arrive. Guys, we live in the 12 months. We're in the 12-month period. We're in that period where, as they understood Jesus, they were understanding that Jesus is saying, you're going to live through that time, but it's meant to stir in you a deeper longing for me to come back and get you. And my heart and my prayer is that we, in the midst of crushing waves, would use them to stir in us a deeper longing for God. To stir in us a longing for Him to show up, to be present in our lives, to be present in everything that's happening. My prayer is that if you're here this morning and maybe you're saying, my whole life is falling apart. I feel like I'm drowning in the waves of my own life. I don't have answers. I don't know where to go. I'm just lost. My prayer is that you would understand that Jesus Christ has come. And He has invited you to enter into His presence through faith in His Son, through faith in Him. And His longing is that you would step out of those waves and understand this depth of love that He's pursued you with. Through the darkest corridors of life, He's pursued you with. That He desperately longs to have a relationship with you. My prayer is that you would step in faith into that relationship. That you would know Him in such a way that, like a bride longing for a groom, you're saying, God, I just want more of you. Show up in my life. Guys, life is not always the way we planned it. But we can know the one who will not rest until all matters are settled in our life. Father, I thank you thank you for your grace, your mercy, your love. Lord, I thank you that you did not rest in your pursuit of us. The story of the gospel is the craziest story in all of human history. That God himself would become a human. That God himself would allow his own creation to do the most vile thing we could possibly do to God, kill him. But in killing you, you were orchestrating the greatest thing ever to happen in the life of human beings. You were buying us out of our slavery to sin. You were making it possible for us to be made new, for the penalty of our sin to be paid full, so that we can enter into your presence as sons and daughters of the living God. Father, if there's somebody here this morning who has not made that step, Lord, I pray that they would do that today. I pray that you would stir in them an understanding of your love for them, your pursuit of them, the fact that no matter what, you have never abandoned them. You've been chasing them down. Lord, I pray that they would open their arms to receive your great gift. And we praise you in the name of Jesus Christ.